Welcome to Deepest Lore, where we examine overlooked or misunderstood stories in popular media. Previously, we examined the 4 main Sonic the Hedgehog games on Sega Genesis, as well as most of the spin-off games that came out in that early part of the franchise, as I argued against the popular misconception that the series never had a complex storyline until Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. That game in many ways functions as a direct sequel to 1994's Sonic & Knuckles, and concludes the storyline that ran through all of the main series games, with most of the details being introduced in Sonic 2. That storyline is usually known as the Death Egg Saga. Surprisingly, however, this early era in the series is actually home to further story arcs beyond the Death Egg Saga, multi-game epics that were told across several of the spin-off games in the series. In fact, one of these arcs functions partially as a direct sequel to the Death Egg Saga, and the first game in that arc happens to be one of the most popular and influential in the entire series. Sonic CD was released nearly a year after Sonic 2, between the seminal arcade masterpiece that is SegaSonic Popcorn Shop and Sonic and Tails, known as Sonic Chaos outside of Japan. However, it actually began development at the same time as Sonic 2, both being alternate sequels to Sonic 1, along with some other early games, such as SegaSonic the Hedgehog. This results in things such as visual design that is much closer to Sonic 1 than Sonic 2. This has always left its place in the timeline somewhat open for debate. As mentioned in previous videos, connections between the 16-bit version of Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles imply that no other games happen between them. In addition, the 16-bit version of Sonic 2 says that Tails follows Sonic ever since they first met, which was in the 8-bit version of Sonic 2. This means that games that do not feature Tails, such as Sonic CD, cannot happen between the 8-bit version of Sonic 2 and the 16-bit version. So therefore, either Sonic CD happens before the 8-bit version of Sonic 2, or after Sonic and Knuckles. Some people have taken this small cameo of Tails saying "see you next game" as an implication that Sonic CD is the final game in the timeline before Tails was introduced. But perhaps more importantly, it would be somewhat odd to place a game that seems in most ways to be a direct sequel to Sonic 1, all the way after the 4th game in the series. There is also one later game that gives a strong implication that would place Sonic CD before Sonic 2, but we'll cover that shortly. After failing in at least 2 attempts to invade South Island and acquire the Chaos Emeralds, Eggman gives up on that particular plan. Instead, he moves on to his new, totally original plan, capturing the Time Stones, which are totally different from the Chaos Emeralds. The Time Stones affect the small moon they rest on, called Little Planet, and cause time fluctuations throughout the moon. Also, apparently due to the Time Stones, Little Planet appears for only a brief time every year, over a place called Never Lake. Eggman takes it upon himself to capture Little Planet and its mysterious stones, and use their temporal powers to carry out his plans of world conquest. After being defeated by Sonic one too many times, he's decided to fight fire with fire, and build himself his own Sonic, called, what else? Metal Sonic. Eggman then goes to Little Planet's past and places robot-making machines to harvest the seeds of the moon's plants to power his robots. He also places holograms of Metal Sonic so as to scare off the local animals. Why didn't he just keep capturing the animals? Who knows. But notably, not even Metal Sonic is powered by an animal. His technical specifications, as shown in the manual, do not make note of such a power source, nor do they reference a seed power source like the rest of the enemies in the game. So Metal Sonic seems to be a case of Eggman going back to his old, pre-Sonic 1 ways, and not using life-powered robots. One could argue that Eggman's constant defeats by Sonic and his friends have made him simply hate animals, and refuse to even use them for his own purposes, or allow them on his planet. Metal Sonic being wholly robotic could represent Eggman's belief that an ultimate weapon would not be weighed down by filthy organics. But that's probably reaching. What does make thematic sense, though, is that Metal Sonic is wholly robotic because he is the opposite of Sonic. Many have argued that the early games in the series show a conflict of nature versus machinery. If Sonic represents nature, then it makes sense that Metal Sonic is not at all natural. I'd go a step further and say that Sonic represents life, so it makes sense that Metal Sonic is wholly devoid of life. Either way, the animals of Little Planet are kept from joining up with Sonic and helping to defeat Eggman. And in the future, which can of course be easily reached on Little Planet, Eggman successfully rules, though he has turned the once idyllic landscape into a dystopia. Something that would be seen again much later, the next time Eggman successfully takes over the world. However, unlike the animals of Little Planet, the animals of Earth are still free to follow the blue blur, and one known as Amy Rose does exactly that. But not out of heroism in her case, rather, because her tarot cards told her that she was destined to be with Sonic. So Sonic, followed by Amy, head to Never Lake, not to fight Eggman, but just to see the beautiful phenomenon. Of course, Eggman has not exactly been subtle about his conquest. Sonic sees Eggman has taken control of Little Planet and heads up there to fight him, with Amy tagging along. She is, of course, promptly captured by Metal Sonic, but regular Sonic fights his way through the past and future, destroying the Metal Sonic holograms, defeating Metal Sonic himself in a race on Stardust Speedway, rescuing Amy, and stopping the latest of Eggman's schemes. Little Planet is saved, and disappears for another year. Interestingly, however, Sonic did not canonically bring about a good future for all of Little Planet's zones, meaning he did not recover all of the Time Stones from Eggman, and failed to destroy Eggman's robot-making machines in at least one zone's past, namely Stardust Speedway. But more on that later. For now, see you next game. The next game in our saga, and in the story of Metal Sonic, would not come for quite some time after Sonic CD. In the meantime, Eggman would try to replace his metallic masterpiece with a series of other robot Sonics, as seen in the 8-bit Sonic 2, the 16-bit Sonic 2, and Sonic & Knuckles. Of course, none of them fare any better, and eventually we would see Metal Sonic make his return in Sonic & Tails 2, known as Sonic Triple Trouble outside of Japan. But that's not the game we're looking at here. Instead, we take an even larger time skip, all the way to 2010, and the release of Sonic 4 Episode 1. And even then, that game doesn't include Metal Sonic, but it's building up to something, so stay with me here. Sonic 4 Episode 1 is an example of what is called a midquel, an entry in a series made to take place between two previously released entries. This game is said to take place shortly after Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but sometimes it's said to take place after Sonic CD, which is then said to go right after Sonic and Knuckles. Indeed, Sonic CD does tie in more strongly with the plot of Sonic 4 and games after it than it does with the Death Egg saga. But of course, Little Planet, which, spoilers, is about to appear again, only appears once every year. And rather than having a whole year where nothing happens, it seems more elegant to say that a bunch of games took place during that time. Either way, Eggman repurposes some of his old robots for one more go at his old rival. The locations of this fight seem to resemble locations from Sonic 1 and Sonic 2, which is odd since Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 take place on different islands. But then it's not like there aren't plenty of other games that feature locations that look like, but are explicitly not, Green Hill Zone. And of course, that includes Sonic 2 itself. So the game could take place on either South Island or West Side Island, or maybe even in a third location. If I were going to argue for one of them though, I'd point out that the special stage most resembles the version seen in Sonic 1, and the special stage seems to be different based on the location from which it is accessed. So perhaps one could use that to argue that Sonic 4 Episode 1 takes place on South Island. But as for what actually happens on this unconfirmed island, Sonic collects the emeralds while speeding through the zones and fighting Eggman along the way. Eventually, however, Eggman escapes to his Egg Station zone, an egg-themed space station which is explicitly not a Death Egg. Sonic then follows in a rocket built by Tails, and the Mad Doctor is once again defeated. Unlike Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Sonic & Knuckles, Sonic 4 Episode 1 does not lead immediately into Sonic 4 Episode 2. In fact, Episode 2 takes place months later. With the physics significantly changed, and a great deal of new features, such as multiplayer and a playable Tails, it really feels like a completely different game. Regardless, Sega tried to promote sales of both games by arguing that they would feature lock-on technology. Lock-on technology, of course, was the marketing tool used to justify selling Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles as two separate games. The Sonic & Knuckles cartridge would open up on top, allowing other games to be plugged into it, unlocking extra features. Most importantly, when locked on with Sonic 3, they would merge into one game, with more content than if playing the game separately. But how could you possibly do anything close to this with games that never received a physical release? Well, you can't. What you get instead is that if you own both episodes of Sonic 4, you unlock something called Episode Metal, a short set of levels set between Episodes 1 and 2. Episode Metal reveals that Eggman's Earth base in Episode 1, Mad Gear Zone, was in fact built to repair Metal Sonic after he was freed from Stardust Speedway's bad future, when Little Planet reappeared over Never Lake 1 year after the events of Sonic CD. Interestingly, this confirms that Sonic failed to create a good future in Stardust Speedway, and that the futures seen in Sonic CD were only 1 year after the present. It only took 1 year for Eggman to create these bad futures. After Metal Sonic's repair, Eggman sends his creation backwards through the levels, or at least one act of each level, of Sonic 4 Episode 1. First you control Metal Sonic through Lost Labyrinth Zone, to gain a mysterious power-up he can use to once again fight Sonic, and hopefully have a chance of defeating the hero who beat him before. A hero who has since unlocked the ability to become a Super Saiyan. Metal Sonic then heads back through Casino Street and Splash Hill to find where Sonic has parked the rocket he used to reach Egg Station Zone. Frustratingly for Metal Sonic though, he arrives just a bit too late, and sees Sonic and Tails fly by in the tornado, before using the rocket to try to chase them down. Meanwhile, Sonic and Tails are blissfully unaware of Metal Sonic's return, but not of Little Planet's return, or of the fact that Eggman is unfurling his latest plot, whatever that is. This becomes especially clear when they take a look at all those Eggman's robots attacking Sylvania Castle Zone, including Eggman himself controlling a boss robot. But as would be expected, they defeat him and move on to the next area Eggman is attacking, White Park Zone. Once they venture far enough into this zone, they can finally see what Eggman's plan actually is. He is covering all of Little Planet in a shell of machinery, the Death Egg 2, using the magical moon itself as the power source for his super weapon. But Sonic and Tails aren't left much time to contemplate the seriousness of this new plan, because Metal Sonic finally catches up to them, using their own rocket. With his new powers acquired in Lost Labyrinth Zone, he's even more formidable than he was a year ago. Of course, a year ago, Sonic hadn't yet met Tails, and with his friend's help, they make short work of the upgraded android. The duo then sabotage Eggman's refineries in the Oil Desert Zone, before the Doctor attempts to retreat to his Sky Fortress. Our heroes take chase in the tornado, but are stopped by Metal Sonic, commanding his own battle-equipped airship. It's possible to simply avoid Metal Sonic's attacks until reaching the Sky Fortress, in which case, he accidentally bumps into the fortress before retreating. But it's also possible to have Tails send the airship's cannonballs flying back at it, destroy his attacker, and end the level early. Either way, after landing on and infiltrating the Sky Fortress, Sonic and Tails eventually get back into the tornado and fight Metal Sonic and his airship again. After being the same bad guy in the same vehicle for the second time, said bad guy flies away and his airship falls, seemingly hitting Eggman's Sky Fortress on the way down and causing it to begin to explode. Sonic and Tails then land back on the Sky Fortress, only now, instead of walking through the fortress for some reason, they just fly directly to where they want to go, which happens to be a pod bay with personal spacecraft, which Eggman then retreats to so he can escape to his Death Egg 2. Luckily for Sonic and Tails, Eggman left an extra space pod. Maybe the genius doctor forgot that Metal Sonic, who he created, can fly through space on his own power. But either way, this convenient mistake allows our heroes to reach the Death Egg 2. Once aboard the Death Egg 2, Sonic and Tails must battle Metal Sonic and Eggman together. But when the battle seems to turn against him, Eggman retreats, seemingly to prepare his last stand, leaving Metal Sonic to race his rival to the heart of the Death Egg 2, in an attempt to stop Sonic from ever reaching his master. But even with his upgraded abilities, Metal Sonic meets the same fate as the last time he was on Little Planet, and fails yet again. With the distraction caused by Metal Sonic, Eggman has taken control of the very heart of the Death Egg 2, but this is not enough to stop Sonic and Tails from preventing Eggman from firing it. As the heart of the machine explodes around him, Sonic and Tails find 2 escape pods, again raising questions of why Eggman has an extra one, and make their way back to Earth. As they do, we can see the lights turn off as Little Planet, which was powering the space station, disappears for another year. But what about the depowered Death Egg 2? It's still up there. After Metal Sonic's return in Sonic 4, which takes place just after the Death Egg saga, the robotic rival would reappear in many of the post-Sonic & Knuckles spin-off games. But while our heroes were busy fighting Metal Sonic and others in these many spin-off games, Sonic 4's other main feature, the Death Egg 2, would be left in space, awaiting its reactivation several years later. Over these years, Eggman has apparently been busy repairing the space station, and making it operational without the help of Little Planet. And when opportunity knocks, he picks the perfect moment to reactivate his second ultimate weapon. He waits until one particular point in the series, when our 3 primary heroes all happen to be diverging into their own solo adventures, and it seems to work to his advantage, because apparently with some time apart, their friendships have grown strained, and now people like Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles are perfectly willing to fistfight each other over who exactly gets to thwart Eggman's latest plan. Not that this is terribly out of character for Knuckles, but still. Though he's spent the last several years ignoring the Death Egg 2 floating in space, once it's finally reactivated, Tails reveals that he has a spaceship, similar to the one seen in Sonic 4 Episode 1, which is capable of reaching the Death Egg 2. But this ship, called the Lunar Fox, requires the use of 8 Chaos Emeralds. Presumably the 8th is just the Master Emerald, whatever. The 8 emeralds are in the possession of 8 different people: Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, Fang, Espio, and new characters Bark the Polar Bear and Bean the Dynamite, who, to be clear, is a duck and not a living explosive. Even though we have actually seen a character like that, called Bomb, back in Chaotix, the same game that introduced Espio. Bean seems to be a reference to, or perhaps an alternate translation of, the character Bin, from Sega's 1988 arcade game Dynamite Ducks, which raises some questions, as in the Master System port of that game, Bin is revealed to actually be a human transformed into a duck. Bean would also go on to appear in Sega's crossover fighting game, Fighters Megamix, in which his alternate costume makes him look almost exactly like Bin. This then also raises the further question of why Sega's crossover fighting game featured Bean and Bark as the closest thing to a representative from the Sonic series, instead of, Sonic. Keep in mind, this is a game that tries to represent Sega's wide variety of franchises so well that it features a barely anthropomorphic car to represent Sega's Daytona series, but yet has no recurring Sonic characters. Then again, by the same token, one could wonder why Bean and Bark were even in Sonic the Fighters, instead of a recurring character, like Mighty, or at least previously existing characters, such as Vector, Charmy, Heavy, Bomb, or Ray. Then again, Bean would soon go on to be in more games than any of those characters up to that point. Bean, but not Bark, would make a third playable appearance in the following year's arcade release, Virtua Striker 2. But Bean's temporary fame would be short-lived, as he, Bark, and Fang for that matter, would not be seen again for another 15 years, until 2011's Sonic Generations, in a tiny cameo on small wanted posters in the background of a single level. But these cameos actually contradict one tiny piece of info related to Bean and Bark's previous appearance in the series. Issue 173 of the Japanese publication Gamist Magazine included a brief story for the game, which says that the emeralds were split up among Sonic's friends around the world, to prevent Eggman from finding all of them, though noting that one emerald was stolen by Fang, since, of course, he is not Sonic's friend. The same story also says that Espio is the one who first discovered Eggman was activating his plan for the Death Egg 2, which makes sense, since the manual for his first game, Chaotix, explains that he is a private detective. However, this story, as a third-party publication, is left in doubt, especially since it explicitly says that Bean and Bark are Sonic's friends, while they would later be implied to be villains, like Fang. But to finally get to the actual events of the game, Sonic beats the emeralds out of everyone else, including people who are definitely his friends, like Amy or Tails. This new violent attitude apparently scares Eggman badly enough to use some sort of machine to create a darkly colored duplicate of his nemesis. Perhaps an interesting harbinger of a character that will be introduced later, especially when seen in relation to some early concept art for said character. Of course, this duplicate does about as well as all the Sonic copies we've seen so far. Speaking of those earlier Sonic copies, Sonic uses the emeralds to fly the Lunar Fox to the Death Egg 2. He makes his way to the Death Egg's Eye, where he fights and defeats a revised Metal Sonic, who has apparently been upgraded with the ability to mechanically transform. He did previously gain the ability to transform in Chaotix, thanks to the power of a dark ring, but that transformation seems quite different from this one. However, the character would later exhibit a more famous transformation, which seems to combine traits of both of these early transformations. Of course, as we know, Metal Sonic isn't the only one capable of transformations, and Super Sonic is more than capable of defeating even this upgraded Faker. But the defeat of this upgraded Metal Sonic apparently causes Eggman to become desperate. Desperate enough to not only activate the Death Egg 2's self-destruct mechanism, but to stay behind and fight Super Sonic, to make sure, at any cost, that Sonic is finally defeated. But he's not called Super Sonic for nothing, so Eggman is defeated in record time, allowing our hero to make it back to the Lunar Fox and escape the destruction of the space station. Then after the credits we find out that Eggman and Metal Sonic made it out in time too. It's one thing to be dramatic, but they weren't about to kill off Eggman in an obscure arcade-only spin-off game. And with that, the threat of the Death Egg 2 is finally over. But despite its conclusion in an arcade-only spin-off game, and the fact that the game that links everything together was a digital-only release that came decades later, the Death Egg 2 saga is probably the most well-known of the classic Sonic arcs, aside from the Death Egg saga itself. But there actually are more multi-game arcs hidden in the depths of early Sonic spin-off games, so tune in next time as we continue to explore those depths, and examine arcs that are, somehow, even more obscure than the Death Egg 2.